Toda rabba, Dr. Porat. Okay, I'm going to just move right along. We're just short on time. So next up we have Professor Yehudah Mirsky, who's an associate professor of the practice of Near Eastern and Judaic studies at Brandeis. The long CV, which you could look up online, and he's the author of widely acclaimed volume, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution. He also has background in law as well. Do you want to?
No.
You're good. Okay.
טוב, דבר ראשון, לפני שנעבור לאנגלית, אני פשוט רוצה להודות לכולכם שבאתם להודות.
The chairman's purpose.
טוב, לפני שאני עובר לאנגלית, אני רוצה להודות לכם, לאכסניה, לדיוויד ובני, לכולכם שבאתם ובעיקר לחיים. אני לא היחיד, אני אחד מיני רבים שציפה המון זמן בכיליון עיניים לספר הזה, ואני מאוד שמח שעוד לא, כמעט שעה, שעוד לא יצא לאור, אבל האור מציץ מהחרקים. באמת חוויית הקריאה הייתה נהדרת. מצד אחד ספר שאומר כל טיעון חכם שחשבת שמישהו יגיד, אבל גם בדרך לא צפויה, באמת דבר דבור על פניו. ועכשיו ברשותכם, so I've been asked, by the way, I think we'll just have to add, first of all, I'm so glad that somebody else, brings things about Grant Gilmore when doing Jewish law. And, those of you who are also thinking of Auden's famous poem, Law Say to Gardeners is the Sun. So I always teach that, whenever I teach, I always start with that famous poem where Auden catalogs every known school of jurisprudence. And yet there was one, it turns out, he left out, I realized, as I was reading this book. So we added a new line to Auden's deathless poem. So the chapters that I'm going to be talking about of this book are chapters 3, Laws Governance, a nod to chapter 4, Laws Talmud Torah, and Halakhah's Talmud Torah, Halakhah's Governance, Halakhah's Talmud Torah, and then finally chapter 5, Halakhah's Theology. So, chapter 3, Halakhah's Governance, explores how despite the absence of conventional enforcement mechanisms, the rabbinic circles from which rabbinic literature emerged clearly see themselves nonetheless as bound by Halakhah. And crucially, that the rabbinic sources, weave together, as Chaim puts it, regulatory Halakhah and non-applied Halakhah. This illustration is taken from Brachot, Mishnah Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, which freely mixes temple rules and present-day or post-temple and near contemporary realities. Now, in an interesting, moving through this chapter, in an interesting reading, Chaim presents the classic debates over whether Ben Soror Morari or Nidachad even existed. Chaim casts those debates, of course, not as historical debates, but as debates over whether Halakhah must be capable on its own terms of implementation, or may at times indeed be entirely theoretical. And this central argument is carried out not through philosophical abstractions, but characteristically and centrally characteristically for this literature, through the discussion of concrete cases, Ben Soror Morari or Nidachad. Now, and while this is going on, of course, we have this phenomenon of long-gone laws of temple and tithe structuring contemporary laws of torts and charitable trusts. Now, this spectrum, where we have that Chaim sets up of sort of law as obviously enforceable regulation, law as impossible ideal, legal doctrines, rulings, discussions in which the two are intermingled, right, which is central to, I think, to how he's presenting this, is made possible by central idea woven throughout Chaim's book, law as, Halakhah as Talmud Torah, right? And one of the really interesting and innovative things here, even though it's something that people who grew up in rabbinic and halachic traditions know in their bones, one rarely sees it articulated in discussing Jewish jurisprudence, the sheer centrality of the act of study as the supreme religious act. Now, and indeed, this chapter on halachic theology, he says, revolves around three core issues. How are mortals to live in God's presence? Question one. Question two, what does it mean to be human? And crucially, what does it mean to be male? And what are the values of humankind? And three, why do we pray and for what? Now, his textual jumping off point here is Menachot Tzadik Tet Amud Bet, and its famous discussion of Talmud Torah as mitzvah, chovah, or bracha, and of the balance of studying Torah and Chokhmah Yivanit, and especially appropriate text to be mentioned in this particular room, in this particular university. Now, the next text that Chaim looks at is the one about Shabbat, from Shabbat Samech Gimel and Bet, on wearing decorative weaponry on the Shabbat. The lessons, so to speak, in very capsulated form, to be drawn from the first sugya, from Menachot, are the centrality of Limud Torah, and of the second, the displacement of the ideal, the Gentile ideal, and indeed the biblical ideal of the warrior, the conventional warrior, by the Talmid Chacham. Just have to mention, I was waiting for the footnote that would reference Daniel Boyarin and was struck that it wasn't there. Now, overall, and Chaim doesn't, as I recall, doesn't get back much to prayer, but we'll leave that for now. Now, Chaim is absolutely right on the centrality of Talmud Torah to the constitutive ideal of Halakhah itself. And I believe that this does in fairness distinguish Halakhah from other legal systems. I mean, those of us who've worked in comparative religion know that the more you go into it, the harder it is to find something that any one religious tradition has that other religious traditions don't. But the centrality of Limud Torah in Rabbinic Judaism and its constitutive place seems to me to be nearly unique. I think even in Islam, right? My sense is that study, as significant as is still largely reserved to ulama. I remember one time talking in grad school to a colleague who was a Jesuit, immensely learned Jesuit, knew many languages, including Hebrew, including Sanskrit, all these kinds of things, discussing Talmud Torah, and he was just astonished, that the idea, he said he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that somebody would, he said, like, I had to take a lot of exams in canon law, but I never once thought of that as a religiously meaningful act. It was just something I needed to know as a priest. And needless to say, American law has no equivalent of Drush v'kabel schar, at least not once you step outside of the universities. Now,
there's no schar in
now, such there is a deep sense then, sort of religiously, ontologically, phenomenologically, in which in some sense Talmud Torah, even at the very highest level, is of a piece with saying Tehillim, right? Is an act of piety. Now at this point I'd actually like to shift a little bit and talk about Jews whose main pious act is saying Tehillim, okay? Of different kinds. Which is to say, one issue that I did have is that chapter 3 talks about governance, Halakhah as governance, but does not talk about Halakhah as power. And it's a subtle difference, but I think it's quite genuine. The difference between governance and power. And in other words, something not dealt with in this book, I felt, at least, was Halakhah as a claim to authority, power over people's bodies, over people's lives. This was obviously the case with gender, which doesn't figure much in the book, but not only with gender, right? I mean, it always also has to do with issues of class, issues of justice generally. Now, this moves in multiple directions, because there were times in Jewish history and antiquity and elsewhere when the rabbis, it's my understanding, at times did sort of like position themselves and sort of gain a kind of status for themselves precisely as protectors of the poor, right? As patrons of the poor. Perhaps we talked about this the other day, analogous in ways in which, the way, sort of like what Peter Brown talks about holy men in antiquity as patrons of the poor. I think one sees that with the rabbis as well. At the same time, issues of justice and injustice, class issues, as they figure in Halakhah, as one form of the exercise of power, along analogous or parallel to gender, doesn't figure much. Now, where Chaim does engage this is in his closing chapter on the state of Israel, where he makes the marvelously interesting point that indeed, when Halakhah is divorced, sundered from, as he beautifully puts it, the covenantal bond of a shared commitment to Torah study, that in those circumstances, Halakhah is indeed reduced to an exercise of naked power. And that was a marvelous point. And while we're at it, I mean, that last chapter you talked about the state of Israel, one thing that occurred to me is it would be interesting to talk about what your ideas of Talmud Torah do to discussions of, in Western democracies, legal multiculturalism and legal pluralism. Just would be interesting to see how that plays out. At any rate, but I think that this issue of, so Halakhah as naked power in the contemporary state of Israel is of course impossible to miss, but it's worth thinking about how much of that was present from the beginning and throughout. Now, on turning to more specifically to theology, as Chaim knows, the Talmud and its tributaries brim, of course, with all kinds of theological concerns. And I have to say that Chaim's formulation of how to live in God's presence, I might add how to live in God's presence when prophecy is no longer available, but it's kind of assumed, is really wonderful. And I think that Chaim's formulation, how to live in God's presence, accounts for all rabbinic theologies. I was sort of thinking about, like in my head, I was like, I know this is totally anachronistic. I was going through the chapters of like Solomon Schechter's aspects of rabbinic theology, and I thought, check, pretty much everything goes there, except it seemed to me eschatology. Okay, now that in turn points to a feature of Halakhah as being and in some ways anti-eschatological. And we view eschatology as truly last things. And this in turn relates to Sholom's contention that messianism is itself inherently antinomian. Now Sholom's claim that mysticism is inherently Jewish mysticism is inherently antinomian has rightly been criticized nearly to the vanishing point. And in this light, I would say, it would be interesting to think of Chaim's ideas in relation to Max Kedushin's idea of Halakhah as normal mysticism. Now, the rabbis did come up with a kind of normal, eschatology may be different. I mean, admittedly, the rabbis did create a normal, what I call a normal eschatology, and we refer to it as the Shemona Esrei. Right, so a very normalized, routinized catechism of eschatology that you say 3 times a day. But of course, I mean, they're doing it in deep awareness that in Christianity, right, of course, messianism becomes explicitly antinomianism, and so forth in Jewish history from the 17th century onwards, eschatology and antinomianism are regularly linked. Now, where eschatology most sharply presses on Halakhah is both in relation to living in God's presence and in seemingly offering a richer vision of that life, a world in which, tam eitz v'hafri shavim, right? And also in regard to the earlier concern, the release from the Halakhah's claim, the earlier concern I mentioned, the release from the Halakhah's claim to power. Now, of course, Olam Hazeh being what it is, the release from one form of power to release from one form of power simply leads another more dreary and depressing one. Now, Rav Kook, Rav Kook was, of course, willing to live these tensions of eschatology and Halakhah to the fullest, precisely because he thought that all these tensions were just about to be resolved tomorrow. In other words, Chaim is indeed a very deep student of Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Lichtenstein, identifying Talmud Torah as the key value and deeply distancing oneself from the ecstasies of eschatology via a very rich conception of the law. Now, the one downside to that very powerful Soloveitchik-Lichtenstein perspective returns to the issue of governance's power. That the deep moral sensitivity and sensibility of that perspective, Soloveitchik, Lichtenstein, etc., is not trained on the Halakhah itself and on its deepest and real injustices. Right? Indeed, and looking back to Rav Kook for a second, for instance, that moral sense of critiquing present-day arrangements is indeed a light coming to us from the future. Maybe, following Chaim's suggestive analysis, it is by incorporating that future light, that light from the future, not as in some sort of ideology, but into the warp and weave of Torah study itself, in all its complexity, give and take, deeply subtle interactions with practice, which he beautifully details, precisely it's through the medium of Torah study that Halakhah's moral failings can be overcome in this fallen world in which Lo Bashamayim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.